Today's episode of Scrolling to Death is sponsored by Bark Technologies. I am so grateful that these days parents have a safer device option for our kids. The Bark phone was built for families who are looking to ramp up their child's online safety. It has parental controls built in and allows us to manage screen time and their entire digital experience super easily. Now let's jump into my conversation with Andrea Brambila about screen time. Welcome to Scrolling to Death. Today I'm excited to be joined by therapist and fellow mom, Andrea Brambila. Hey, Andrea.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
Yay. Okay. So yeah, I'm so excited to talk about all kinds of things. And, but first, as a therapist, you specialize in perinatal mental health and developmental psychology. Can you tell me what that means?
Yeah, so perinatal mental health is basically like the mental health surrounding pregnancy. So
Okay.
prepartum, pregnant, and then postpartum.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot going into that in terms of like, I specialized in women that were having fertility issues for a long time.
Okay. Yep.
And then working through the pregnancy and then all of the fun postpartum stuff afterwards. And I've always had a really strong interest in developmental psychology, which is essentially like how does your brain develop throughout your entire life cycle, but mostly
Mm-hmm.
looking at like birth to about age 25 in terms of development.
Amazing. Okay. That mental health conversation around pregnancy and after birth is something I didn't really think about much. Like, I don't know, when you have
Yeah,
kids in your late 20s, maybe I was just too young to like really think about it. But I have friends having babies now and they're like really cued in to how they're feeling and asking for help. And I'm like, man, I wish I was at that
that's
phase.
that's so great. So when I had my son, I was 24,
Mm-hmm.
and I was newer into the therapy world. And 10 years ago, everything was just postpartum depression.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not have that. I had postpartum anxiety, and it took
Mm-hmm.
me a very long time to even realize that I had postpartum anxiety as a
Yeah.
therapist.
Yeah. Is there a postpartum OCD as well? Is that something I've heard?
Yes, I think that really like any of the mental health disorders can be triggered by the hormone fluctuations around postpartum.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
Okay, so today we're going to focus on the importance of independent play, some tips for limiting screens. I also just want to lament together about raising kids during COVID and what we learned during that time. But let's touch on, you have a large community on Instagram. Your handle is Brambila_bits. And I wonder, like, what is that journey? What inspired you to start reaching parents on Instagram?
Yeah, so I had a really challenging introduction to parenthood. My husband and I had a couple of pregnancy losses before we got pregnant with our son.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had my son, and I struggled significantly with postpartum anxiety, not depression, but just like very nervous, anxious all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I really felt that way for about 4 years, even doing like
Wow.
therapy and very traditional treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it took me a really long time to get brave enough to have our second child.
Mm-hmm.
And when we did, I really decided at that point, like, I cannot repeat this. Like it was manageable, but it was just so close to being unmanageable. And it was just so exhausting.
Yeah.
And so coming through it on the other, like when you're in it, sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
don't realize like how draining it is. And then you get to the
Mm-hmm.
other side and you're like, wow, that was
Mm-hmm.
really rough.
Yeah.
So when I got pregnant with my daughter, I decided to really research some like actionable things outside of the therapeutic world that I could do that would help support me and my therapy, and manage my postpartum anxiety a little bit better.
Yeah.
And there were a number of things that I found that were very contradictory to the way that parenting is, I feel like, displayed or shown these days, especially with social media.
Okay.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
you see all of these like lovely invitations to play where like parents are like setting up like really pretty activities that take a long time and require a lot of prep work. But it's a lot to maintain and keep up with and do on a day-to-day basis. And
Right.
so a lot of what I was coming across when I was researching was that some of these things are really like, they're just making it more challenging than it needs to be in terms
Mm-hmm.
of parenting. And so I really took a step back and started to work to apply a lot of what I had read just sort of as an experiment. And I was really amazed at how different my second postpartum experience was. Even though I was working more, I had less support in terms of like family.
Yeah.
But my postpartum experience was just so much different, and I felt so much better. I wasn't overstimulated all the time. I didn't feel overwhelmed all the time. And a lot of it was because we transitioned our family into a much more like low screen lifestyle as a whole. And we learned how to really support independent play so that like my daughter can do things. She can play while I am doing things. And then when she rests or when she goes to bed at night, like I can actually relax instead of feeling like I need to speed clean my entire house or like try and run all of my errands while she's napping at home with dad. And like just so much pressure was taken off of me. And so at that point, I started wanting to kind of share this stuff from like a mental health perspective. And things kind of transitioned. And as I was doing more of these things and really continuing to do all of the research, you know, I have an older son who's almost 11.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting because there was more emerging research on things like social media and cell phone use and YouTube and how all of these things are impacting some of these older kids. And I had seen that in my own private practice working with teenagers. And so that's really what I share is like, how do we approach technology as like a holistic family unit in a way that supports like my mental health, supports my husband's mental health, allows us to get things done, and also protects both of our kids from these things that I think we are seeing becoming more and more concerning. So that was a very long answer.
No, that was so interesting. And there's so many things there. I think it's so fascinating how just limiting of the screen time and ramping up of independent play and experiences can positively affect, you know, an almost 3-year-old, an 11-year-old, a grown woman and a grown man, you know, across the board, the benefits are pretty impressive. And you touched quickly or briefly on that you were seeing on, I'm assuming Instagram or whatever social media platform, like these perfectly put together activities that parents are setting up for their kids. And that was something that I noticed a lot through COVID specifically was everyone's home. And how are these moms like thriving and putting together these amazing activities for their kids and making the most of their time? And I'm sitting here trying to work and just crying and struggling and all this stuff. But first of all, the reminder that like, that perfect looking activity is not perfect. Like the picture is perfect, but what's really happening in real life is not.
And the reality that a kid is probably playing with it for like 4 minutes and it took 35 minutes to set up.
Yeah. And is it more for the picture and the portrayal of the social media, you know, perfection rather than for the child's experience? Like you have to ask. Jumping in here to tell you guys a little bit more about the best phone for kids, and that is the Bark phone. If you don't want your kids signing up for social media, an iPhone is not going to do it. The Bark phone starter plan comes with talk and text only. If and when you're ready to start integrating some social media access or more screen time, there are advanced plans available that offer social media, but not without your approval. Plus, it has advanced content monitoring and will send you alerts of potential dangers. So when it comes to a basic phone that won't addict your child and distract them from school or healthy activities, the Bark phone is where it's at. If your child already has an iPhone or an Android and you don't want to switch it up, please layer on the Bark parental controls as a baseline. You can set rules around screen time, block certain websites and apps. You still get alerts and tons more helpful options for parents. Back to my chat with Andrea about screen time. So, what is your family's approach, if you could summarize it, to screen time specifically now?
Yeah, so like I said, we're pretty low screen. So I definitely don't feel like, you know, there are some people that would say like screens are not ever acceptable or appropriate. And I don't agree because I think that we live in a reality where like that's just not realistic.
Yeah.
I do think that it's really important for us to be mindful about how, so I feel like there's two ends of the spectrum. So I get parents that will say like, this is too extreme. You know, we're in a world where screens are around, like we need to teach our kids to be around screens. And then I get other parents who are like, screens are the worst thing in the world. Like keep them away from your kids at all costs. Like live in a commune.
Right.
off grid, and that's just not realistic for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So our approach, I feel like, is much more in the middle, where, you know, like we allow our kids to watch TV. I'm very mindful about what sort of shows my daughter watches specifically, because she's a lot younger and she's a lot more easily overstimulated, and she's a lot spicier than my son. So when she gets overstimulated, she's a harder pill to swallow.
I like the term spicier.
Yeah. But so we're very mindful about the shows that she watches. She gets a lot less screen time, again, because she gets overstimulated a lot more. So she watches TV maybe like 20 to 40 minutes a day, about 3 to 5 times a week. And then my son, who is almost 11, he probably gets about an hour of screen time a day. And his kind of varies between like watching TV or playing video games. Like he likes Minecraft. He likes some of the he likes Mario Kart, like some of the racing games.
Yeah.
But we do try to be really mindful about setting boundaries that we can maintain and that don't feel like burdensome to us, but are also still protecting our kids. So like one area that was a big struggle for us for a long time was YouTube for my older son, because he was, I think he was 5 when COVID happened. And so he got a lot more screen time during those years, and he would watch shows on YouTube. And back then it really didn't feel like a concern for us. He wasn't coming across things that were inappropriate. But he was like watching shows where adults were acting like idiots, and he was reenacting that. And it was like just obnoxious almost behavior. And so we tried to set limits around it. We battled with it for months, where we would, you know, like, you can only watch these channels, you can only watch this amount. And it felt like we were constantly policing him. And he was getting into trouble with it. And we ultimately just we eliminated it, because at some point I realized I'm a therapist. I understand child development. Like, I can't expect, it's not developmentally appropriate for me to expect him to be able to manage himself with this type of app that is more and more designed to like keep people glued to it. And, you know, again, 5 years ago, we didn't have things like shorts. Like, there wasn't an algorithm that was like well informed. So it was just a different experience for him. And over the years, it became more and more problematic. And as it became more and more problematic, it just got to a point where we eliminated it. And it was, we had to be really clear about, like, this isn't a punishment. It's just not working for us as a family. And we're arguing about an app. So we don't allow YouTube. He doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't have a personal device. He has like a very old school iPod Touch that he will use at home to like FaceTime his friends. And that's pretty much hit. Like, he gets about, like I said, about an hour a day on average.
And you mentioned like some parents will say, well, they need to learn how to use it, you know, at some age. And I've talked to experts that are like, listen, they make these iPads to be able to be used by babies. So there's no like learning curve here. And by the time that they're adults, so some people will say, well, they need to learn how to use it for adulthood, for jobs. Things are going to change so much in 4, 5, 10 years that whatever's available then is going to look so much different. So your kid doesn't need to learn how to use an iPad as a child. Like, it's just not a necessity.
When I look back at like my experience growing up, so I'm 30, I just turned 37. Like, my high school had a computer lab, and we had like a family computer at home, and that was it. And now I work online. I'm fully remote. I work for a large corporate company. I'm like very, very normal remote working situation. I work in Excel and PowerPoint all day, every day. But I didn't need to learn that until my 20s. And you pick it up. At that point, like, it's fine.
So there's that point, which is interesting. And I appreciate the like personal device stance. I think that delaying kids' use of personal devices, especially ones that are connected to the internet and can download whatever app they want, it's really important to delay that. Do you allow any personal device time for your almost 3-year-old?
No. Mm-mm.
Right. Okay.
That's very intentional.
Yeah.
Because again, like as a therapist, as I've come across more and more emerging research, all of this is so new.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, even when like we had our son, like the iPad was very new,
Mm-hmm.
but there wasn't any data around like, is this appropriate for a 2-year-old? But now we have got
Mm-hmm.
some new emerging data that's really showing like there's a difference in the way that kids receive and interact with like a TV that's on and like a
Mm-hmm.
smaller screen that's in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a lot of
Yeah.
it could be proximity, but like even when you watch like a small child like watching TV, like if I watch my toddler, like she'll move around and she'll like
Mm-hmm.
kind of play sometimes if the TV's on. She's
Yeah,
not
mine too.
like locked in unless she's just really tired. But it's
Mm-hmm.
very different like when you see a kid like on an iPad or on a cell phone. Like it's just
Mm-hmm.
because it's like right there, it's
Yeah.
just a different experience for them.
Yeah. And I wonder what your thoughts are. So every time I go to the grocery store, you see moms or dads with the little baby or the toddler, like just staring at the device in the cart. What do you feel about that specifically? Is it okay? Should parents try not to be handing their kids devices at the grocery store or at the restaurant, for example?
Yeah, I think that that's a really hard subject, specifically because of the way that our culture looks
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
childhood.
Yes.
So like, I don't know when, but at some point we have expected for children to act like small adults.
Mm-hmm.
And if they make any sort of noise or like they're disruptive or heaven forbid that they like move faster than like a walk, like it's just not appropriate. And
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of pressure for parents to contain their children in these public
Mm-hmm.
spaces. And when
Mm-hmm.
you look at other countries, there isn't necessarily that same pressure, and you don't see the same use of technology in cultures where it is more acceptable for kids to be kids and to be kids in public.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I personally am very much an advocate for one of the best things that we can do for our kids is to allow them to experience the world as it is without
Mm-hmm.
distractions.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the best things that we can do is like take them to go run errands and to slow down enough to like allow them to have some sort of engagement. So for example, like I can take my daughter to like when we have Amazon returns, we
Mm-hmm.
do it at Kohl's, and like
Right.
I
Me
will
too.
let her like actually walk through the store and like hold on to the package and like
Mm-hmm.
she'll put it on the thing and like I'll do the app, and then as we're walking out like she'll sometimes like climb on some of the furniture that's out on display, or
Mm-hmm.
she'll like touch some of the clothes, and I'm not like dragging her out of the store or like sticking her in the cart, which is nothing wrong with like putting a child in the cart. We put her in the cart when we take her to the
Mm-hmm.
grocery store all the time.
Yeah.
Um, but I think if we can slow down and allow them to engage with the world,
Mm-hmm.
she's still going to have tantrums. She just had a tantrum
Mm-hmm.
at a clothing store recently. Um, but I see it so much less frequently with her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is because like she's not being overstimulated, and
Mm-hmm.
she's being allowed to like engage with the world in a way that kids like their brains just crave, like they're trying to understand, they're trying to figure the world out. And
Yeah.
I think that we've started kind of depriving them of that experience. So
Yeah.
my thought
Yeah.
is like I don't recommend it.
Mm-hmm.
Now I
Mm-hmm.
get that like a lot of parents feel a lot of pressure to like, I got to get the grocery shopping done and I don't want my kid throwing a fit because everyone's going to stare at me. So
Yeah.
I genuinely like empathize with it, but I think that we are definitely doing our kids a massive disservice by not
Mm-hmm.
allowing for them to experience the world as it is.
Yeah. And I think that's the main issue with handing the device. It's not even that them staring at the device. I mean, it's not good for them to do that. They're not actually, especially under 2, like absorbing anything educational from it. But what you're doing is blocking the interaction with the world around them and with
Mm-hmm.
you. Like they learn their language skills, their emotional skills, their socialization from engaging with you as the parent, and you're just like blocking that with the screen. And so I would love to see more parents just getting a little more uncomfortable in those situations, and challenging their child a little bit more to to delay giving them the screen as long as possible. I think we'd be surprised at what our kids can pull off if we're engaging them
Yeah.
right.
And they're totally capable. I mean, when we
Yeah.
think about like these types of screens are very new, like within the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Like what did parents do before that when we had to go
Yeah.
grocery shopping? Like put
Yeah.
your kid in a grocery cart and like we
Yeah.
got through it.
Yeah, I do the same things at restaurants that my dad used to do and my mom. So we play I Spy, we play 20 questions, and we also take the like little sugar packets and you can like build little houses and things with them, like double decker houses. And so I just do what my parents taught me to do in a restaurant, and that is engage them. Like I don't always love playing 20 questions with a 6-year-old, but I just
Yeah.
like that's the time to engage with them. Otherwise, I don't need to take if I don't have the energy for it. Like I'm not going to take them
Let's
to
just
the
eat at home.
restaurant. Right. Right.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of parents, especially at restaurants, so they'll hand their kids the device because they want to break and they want to be able to talk to each other and have quiet time. So what do you advise to parents like who say, well, if I don't give them screen time, like how do I get a break? What do you kind of say to that?
So I definitely, again, I don't feel like I am super like anti screens.
Yeah.
I definitely think that my recommendation is that like, especially the early years are very short.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even especially for me, when I was struggling with postpartum anxiety and we were just like getting through every day, it felt like for the rest of our lives, we were going to be getting through every day. And then suddenly I woke up and like my son was 5 and like sitting through a meal at dinner was like no big deal. It was like fine.
Yeah.
And so my thought behind that is like, the years, it feels hard, but if you can delay the personal devices until after, I say generally like sometime between 4 and 7, I see a lot of benefit to it. And I think, and this is just anecdotal experience, but I think that you will have a child that is easier to take out and do things with if they have gotten acclimated and used to like going out and not having the screens there. And I get it. Like my husband and I, we didn't have support in terms of like babysitters or, and honestly, like I just don't generally trust like adults around my children. Unsupervised, so we don't do babysitters a ton. And so I think we've had like 3 date nights since my daughter has been born, and it's not always easy, but there's always a trade-off.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like so you say like you're not anti-screen at all, and I'm in the same boat as you, but there's such like a variation of how different households treat screens, and nothing like there's no like right or wrong answer here, but I think everyone can make adjustments to expose their children to a bit more independent play and non-screen activities, and I think that's only going to benefit them. So like an adjustment we made recently is my husband and I decided we're going to leave our phones in our bedroom when the kids are home, so we don't ever have our phones on us when the kids are around. And, I want to say we're amazing at it. It's hard sometimes. And now I think we need a landline downstairs because I'm like, oh, no one can get a hold of me. That was an adjustment that I realized recently that I was like, this is so beneficial. Like they are getting my full attention. And yes, it's hard sometimes when I'm cooking and I'm like, oh gosh, how do I have to look up like this measurement. So when we have Alexa down, like, again, I'm not like no tech. We have Alexa, we watch TV at night together, but I'm very sensitive, especially to like short form content. So my kids have never watched YouTube. I don't even let them watch TV shows that much. Like we watch movies mostly that are like have a story and a lesson. Like
and
I feel
an
like
arc.
Yeah. And like not an endless series of a show that just like hooks you at the end and gets them watching the next one, the next one, the next one.
Yeah.
And they're so quick and like the cuts are so fast. So I want to like give them the gift of an attention span. And so I think I'm always learning too and making like small adjustments in our house that I hope they will benefit from. And one thing I want to touch on is screens at school. So two of my kids are in public elementary school, and they are given individual devices in class. And now that I'm realizing how much they use those devices, I feel like I have to be even more conservative at
Monitored
home.
at home.
Yeah, to
Mm-hmm.
balance out the screen time they're getting at school. So, what does your 11-year-old son's screen time look like at school? Is he getting a lot, do you think?
Yeah, so we actually, I observed his class a couple of times.
Uh-huh.
And they definitely get more screen time than what I would personally prefer.
Right.
Uh, and I feel like prior to COVID, I'm sure that there were personal devices in classrooms more than what I realized.
Mm-hmm.
But like I distinctly remember him going to kindergarten and he didn't have a device.
Okay.
And then first grade, COVID happened and he didn't have a device before then. And then he came home with a device. And now
Mm-hmm.
it's like the devices have just never left. And so there are a couple of things that I have asked his teachers the last couple of years in terms of
Mm-hmm.
like, if you're not doing actual instruction time, like if it's just like tech time, can he please just like read a book? And like, I know that that kind of
Mm-hmm.
singles him out.
No.
But he's a boy. And so like if
Yeah.
he's overstimulated or if he's like hyper, it's even more of a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been really fortunate that like his teachers in elementary school have been very supportive of it.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, like there have been times where we've considered like, do we want to continue with public school?
Yeah.
Specifically because it felt like he was getting a lot more screen time than what we were comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've tested the devices and we've definitely seen that like they can access things that are not age appropriate for a 10-year-old boy.
Yep.
And so I think we're all just kind of doing the best that we can with what's available to us. He's a very social kid. He really loves going to school. And so I don't want to take it away from him.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, the plan is for him to continue public school, but
Yeah.
I feel like that's always subject to change. But
I'm in the same boat as you.
it's so hard. And I
Yeah.
get that, like, I do believe homeschool kids can have a very active social life.
Yeah.
But he's made friends. He loves his school. He loves his friends.
Yeah. And
He
10 or 11
enjoys-
is a tough age to switch out. That's
It
tough.
is. And something that my husband and I talk about a lot is like part of the reason that we have enjoyed this transition from like, I feel like being the typical like American family that had like the TV on in the background most of the time. And like,
Mm-hmm.
Things are very different now. And I feel like my kids both have just like an honest childhood more.
Mm-hmm.
Like they play. Whereas
Yeah.
like 3 years ago, I didn't see my son play. And I thought at that point, like he was 7. So like maybe he's just beyond play.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the last like 2 years, like he plays and he builds things with Magnetiles and he's almost 11.
Yeah.
And so it's just
Wow.
been really incredible to like see like, no, like they still like their little brains and like their emotions and like all of it, like they really do thrive with like an actual long childhood. Like childhood shouldn't end at age 6, 7 years old.
Yeah, like a play-based childhood. And if your 7, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old is spending a lot of time on devices and you want to take a step back, like I think it's important to realize like they can get that play-based mindset back. Like they can transition back. It may take a little bit because their brains have been wired one way to the electronic and the fast moving and all of that. But it's not too late, I don't think, to pull back a little bit. I mean, yeah, my 8, almost 9-year-old daughter like plays with dolls still. Like she wakes up in the morning and plays for an hour or reads like without waking us up. And it's like so wonderful. Like she doesn't even have an option. And I want to touch on like every child is so different too. So my son, we got the what were they called, like Amazon Fire tablets at some point, for an airplane, like a trip. And then we had them at home and the kids liked them, so we're like, okay, we'll do 20 minutes a day of time they can spend on their tablets. And literally my 6-year-old, it's like all he talked about, all he thought about, like was so obsessed with it that I was like, this isn't good. He's not putting any energy or thought into anything else, not being creative. He just wants to with the addictiveness of these games, like he would like have an egg that was going to hatch the next day. So it's like you have to go back to like hatch your egg. Otherwise it like dies or
And
something.
see
Like
what's in
that's
there.
stressful, to like get back,
Yeah.
and the points for coming back every day. And I didn't feel good about that at all. And so we tried to cut back for a while, and then he would sneak it. And so I was like, listen, this kid is especially sensitive to this, and we're just going to pull it all together. And he has not brought it up like for a year. Like he doesn't care. He's completely now invested in his Bakugan and his Pokemon cards. Like he doesn't need the electronics. So like we'd be surprised at how quick our kids will transition off of the electronics and actually just like be more creative as children. Okay, so what are your thoughts around devices? So a lot of parents are starting with watches these days, so the smartwatches at a certain age, and also giving smartphones to their children, pretty early, some as early as like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. What are your thoughts around that? Like, what is your plan for giving your kids access to their own devices?
Yeah, so that's changed over the years. I would say, so he's about to turn 11. And so we homeschooled him for first grade during COVID. He went back in second grade. And
Mm-hmm.
when he went back, I would say about half of his classmates had a cell phone. And I was really
Wow.
surprised because I was like, well, he's not like, is he taking, like, he doesn't need to take a business call. He's
Yeah.
not calling his friend. He's not asking to like call his friends on my phone. Like, what does he
Yeah.
need? What do they need a cell phone for? And then like some of the kids like had parents that were divorced. So I can understand that. I feel like in those
Yeah.
situations, there might be room for exploring what are the options. I would
Mm-hmm.
never recommend a cell phone for a kid that's not in at least middle high school.
Mm-hmm.
Just there's
Mm-hmm.
just too much opportunity, too much freedom. And it kind of goes back to like what we had talked about previously, where like you as a parent have to spend so much energy policing it and setting
Mm-hmm.
these boundaries and making sure that the boundaries are followed. And then like if they're not, like is there a consequence? And like
Mm-hmm.
it's just so much stress
Yep.
that it's just, to me, I don't think it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
So our plan for him 2 years ago, we initially thought like, well, maybe he's ready for a phone. I would say like 75% of his friends had phones, and he was just getting to the age where he was starting to like have times where he was like going to someone's house without us.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
that kind of felt like, well, maybe like, I think as parents, we come up with the worst like case scenario. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what if he's uncomfortable and like
Yeah.
he wants to
Yeah.
call us to come home?
Yeah.
And that's yet to happen. But we thought about it, and there was just something in me that was like, I don't know, I don't feel great about it. I want to test the waters. And
Mm-hmm.
so we got him literally like the day before they went off the market, we got him an iPod Touch.
Mm-hmm.
And my thought process behind that was like, okay, he can only use it when it's like at home because it's not connected to like a cell service. And he has to use his dad's Apple ID to like
Okay.
do anything. So he can't download apps without my husband like typing in a
Mm-hmm.
password.
Right.
And I feel like those parameters made it so that like he has this thing where he can like FaceTime his friends over the summer when they like want to talk or like make plans, or sometimes like they'll play Minecraft together and they like
Mm-hmm.
FaceTime each other.
Mm-hmm.
But because he can't download apps consistently, and because like there's no YouTube on it, because it's literally just a communication device,
Mm-hmm.
it's not as appealing for him. And
Yeah.
like he'll go days where it's just dead and he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
notice.
Yeah.
And
It's a
so I
tool
think
for
that,
him. Like it's a tool, not a
yeah,
toy. Yeah.
yeah. And I think that a lot of parents struggle with like, how do I introduce this in a slow way? Because
Mm-hmm.
you don't want your kid to like have no understanding or no access or be able to relate with their peers, because that's
Mm-hmm.
important. But I do think that we also have to protect them. So we're not planning on getting him a phone until he is probably in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be a smartphone. And those
Mm-hmm.
are conversations that we're having with him now, because I don't want for him to get to like sixth grade and have this like expectation that he's going to get an iPhone and
Yeah.
then he gets like a flip phone.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I want for him to have that understanding. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of very transparent conversations, and I do have a large social media platform. So that I feel like that's given us some opportunities to have conversations around like, look, like I'm posting stuff that's just like about like parenthood, and like people still make horrible comments on my stuff, and I'm an
Oh my
adult.
gosh. Yeah,
And like these
I
are
know.
other adults. Like imagine what kids are saying to each other. Like it's horrible.
That's a great
And
lesson. I should
yeah,
start
so
doing
he
that.
yeah, so I think it's taken, he started asking for a phone when he was about 7 when he saw his friends.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it took probably a good like year and a half for him to like accept the fact that like
Mm-hmm.
he's just not gonna get a phone for right now.
Yeah.
And there have definitely been like harder moments with that, but I think that because we have taken the time to really explain the
Mm-hmm.
rationale behind it,
Mm-hmm.
and we also are really mindful about like, because I think at his age peer experiences are really important, so like we have his friends over, and like we have a small group of friends whose parents like I really like, and like we spend
Mm-hmm.
a lot of time together, and they hang out, they play,
Mm-hmm.
they do things together, and so I feel like that alleviates some of that like pressure on him.
Mm-hmm.
And we do not plan on introducing social media until he's like well into high school.
Yeah, yeah. I'm like, well, I'm a never unless some of these federal bills pass to make social media be safer. Um,
Yeah.
but I get having to teach them how to use something safely while they're in your home before you just like let them loose as an adult. So I don't know. Luckily, I have many years before that happens,
Yeah.
but how do you deal with when he goes to a friend's house and you know that friend may have like a smartphone with unrestricted access? How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So honestly, that isn't something that we have navigated at this point.
Okay.
He really only has he has a lot of friends, but
Mm-hmm.
he only has 2 or 3 friends that like I have a rule where like I'm protective of my time too, as like
Mm-hmm.
I'm a whole person, and so like
Mm-hmm.
my weekends I also want to do things that I enjoy,
Mm-hmm.
and so his friends, in order for us to like spend a fair amount of time with them, like I have to also like their parents, and that
Oh
sounds
yeah.
bratty sometimes, I think. And
No,
I
I
think
think it's just
some people feel
honest.
like, yeah, I'm just not going to spend 3 hours with someone that I don't enjoy being around.
Yeah,
And
totally.
my son's also not old enough for me to feel comfortable being in someone else's home unless I really know their parents. And I'm not going to really know their parents unless I
Yeah.
happen to like them.
Right. Right.
And so fortunately, he hasn't had, like I said, there's only 2 or 3 people that we really like. And I feel like they're
Mm-hmm.
very similar minded.
Good.
Um, and so that hasn't been a thing.
Okay.
I think that there's a lot of room for transparency though. I think
Yeah.
for some reason people get really uncomfortable telling other parents, like, I'm not, for example, like one of his friends is allowed to watch YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had a lot of conversations with his mom, like, Enrique is not allowed to watch YouTube. That's just
Mm-hmm.
not a thing.
Yeah.
And she is really respectful of that.
Mm-hmm.
And when he's over there, like, they don't watch YouTube,
Right.
because it's just an expectation.
Yeah. It is uncomfortable, those conversations. We had a play date with my 8-year old, her friend at the park, and I chatted with the mom for like an hour. And my daughter's friend asked for the mom's phone to look something up. And then the girls were then over on the grass, like just scrolling on the mom's phone. And I felt like I don't want that to be happening, but I feel like I can't tell this mom, like, hey, don't give your daughter your phone, you know? So
Yeah.
I just said, I got to go tell my daughter something. And so I walked over there and was like, hey, like, let's cut the phone and we're going to go in a few minutes. But it just felt very uncomfortable. And also like, I don't have that relationship with that mom yet where I felt like I could,
Yeah. I
and
think you have to.
you start to feel like you're trying, like, I'm not better than anybody. I'm not trying to lecture anybody on their decisions. It's just what I've chosen for my child. So it is very tricky.
It
And
is.
I'm currently also assessing like our school community, and a lot of the parents are very heavy with the devices in our area. And so I'm second guessing to our school like
That's hard.
community. It's really hard, and I'm
That
looking
is really
at,
hard.
we can't homeschool. I had to do recordings for at home for my
Yeah.
work, but looking at private schools, which are expensive. So there's no situation where you're going to have no exposure to other kids with devices. But Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to navigate for sure. Sorry, I cut you
It is,
off.
but so that leads to kind of the point where like we don't want for our son to watch YouTube
Hmm.
because that's just something. But at the same time, like the older that they get, I feel like the more when there are one-off situations,
Hmm.
it's easier to say like, okay, that's a one-off situation. So like for
Yeah.
example, like
Yeah.
when my kids go to my dad's house, like they're
Hmm.
gonna watch more TV.
Yeah, me
And
too.
we're yeah, so like
Yeah.
I think a lot of parents have, I've seen a lot of DMs where people are like, well, how do we deal with this? Like when they go
Mm.
to grandpa's house, it's like, if it's not a problem, if it's like
Hmm.
if they're going over there once, every couple of months, like don't sweat it. Like if
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
home culture is consistently like, these are our
Hmm.
values and our expectations when there are those one-off situations, like
Yeah.
don't feel like you're like contaminating your kid from this like
Yeah.
one-off situation. I feel like it's like almost like that like health food craze where it's
Yeah.
like the one time I have
80,
sugar,
20.
like I'm gonna
Yeah.
break.
Yeah. A mom just reached out to me the other day and was like, I am at a soccer team party or some sports team party, and there's 20 kids and half of them have phones out. And what do I do? Because I can't, I can't ask all these
Yeah,
kids'
no,
parents.
you just,
And I was like, listen, don't stress
it's
about
a
it. It's
party.
okay. Like, you can always also communicate next time with your kid ahead of time and say, hey, you know that we don't do devices. So if you're seated next to a child with a device and they're trying to show you things, like you can remove yourself and do something else, or you can suggest to the kid, like, hey, that's what I teach my daughter. Like, say, hey, to your friend, like, let's do this over here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
think of new ideas to do something different. That's not scrolling on YouTube. So yeah, that's totally relatable. And I totally agree that these one-off situations, like my kids just went to my parents' house where they do watch a lot more TV there. And, it's just a balance. They
Yeah,
also play hard there, but that's okay. Like they can have that balance.
I think having that like home culture,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what's the most important.
Yes. Agree. Okay. So we talked about social media briefly, but why do you feel like you're going to delay social media as long as you can?
I mean, so many reasons.
I know.
um I did a little bit of an experiment where I set up a second account, an Instagram account,
Mm-hmm.
in my husband's name.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I added like myself as a friend and like a
Mm-hmm.
couple of like our mutual friends. Um, and I was amazed because to me, Instagram is generally like one of the more, it's not Snapchat.
Clean-ish. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. But like, even like on his explore page, it was like active, like women influencers that are like in very little clothing, which like I don't have anything against, but like it's just
Mm-hmm.
very interesting because that's not what's showing up on my
Mm-hmm.
explore page. But because he's, a man in his 40s, like that's what's showing up on his explore page, even though he hasn't
Yep.
that account has not interacted with anything that would lead the algorithm to say
Oh
like
my God.
this is what he wants to see.
Yeah.
So that is concerning. And I feel like when you look at like the data and the research around like brain development,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's so much evidence that shows that like early exposure
Mm-hmm.
and repeated exposure has such a strong impact on like how they view things down the road. So like things like pornography, like
Mm-hmm.
would I be upset with my like 17-year-old son having like a Playboy? Like, no, it's not what I want. Like, it's not
Yeah.
what I want to come across as a parent.
Right.
But I think that's very different than like a 17-year-old boy constantly being able to access hardcore porn. And I think that
Yeah.
that changes how they view
Yeah.
something that is very important because I feel like their adult sex life is something that is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing like what the algorithms are pushing out to young boys is very
Mm-hmm.
concerning for me.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
bullying aspect is very concerning for me, especially with, I know the personality of my son. He is very much like a people pleaser. He
Mm-hmm.
wants to like be liked.
Yeah.
Um, and having worked with teenagers in my
Mm-hmm.
private practice, I saw like we say like sticks and stones don't break your bones.
Mm-hmm.
But like when you're repeatedly being told that you're ugly or you're
Mm-hmm.
unlikable over and over and over, and it's on a public platform, like
Yeah.
the damage that it does And even if your kid makes it out through that and they're later on like a functioning adult, like that's just, I don't want for that to be the overarching like experience of their formative years. I want for them
Yeah.
to have good friends, and I
Yeah.
want for them to have normal like experiences in person, face to face.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's just so much room for like exploitation, and
Yeah.
I can't wrap my brain around a way to make it a palatable, safe experience.
Well, it's not, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And if it were, like, if it were just chatting with your friends, sending silly photos, maybe exploring an interest of yours, like a healthy interest, that would be fine. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, the algorithms are serving harmful content. So if you would have set up that test account, even as a 13-year-old who can sign up without parental permission, a male, that same algorithm would have showed women in little clothing. It would have been very similar to what you saw on the adult man's algorithm feed, which is so concerning. I mean, the sexualized material on these children's
Yeah.
feeds, let alone the predators and the bullying and the drug content and all this stuff. I mean, the social media companies are serving it to them because it's getting a reaction from them and it keeps them on the platform longer. Even
Yeah.
if it's like a negative reaction, that actually has been proven to keep kids on there longer than even just like a happy reaction, which is really sick. So yeah, I'm with you. I think you're making the right decision there. And you mentioned pornography. I have a really good episode called, it's just called Kids and Porn.
I listened to that.
Good. Okay. Yeah. That was with Kristen Jensen at Defend Young Minds. And that was fascinating. I mean, the studies around how early access to pornography is affecting boys and teens and into adulthood. Yeah. Just the extent at which what they're being shown compared to what, we may have seen when we were young is just pretty concerning. So recommend that. Social media can just be a gateway into all that type of content because social media
Yeah.
houses a lot of that content as well. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important for parents to realize that just because social media platforms say they're for 13-year-olds or targeted to kids as just a fun app, doesn't mean that they're telling the truth.
Yeah.
And what they're being shown is highly inappropriate quite
Yeah. And
often.
I'm sure you've read or come across the book, The Anxious Generation. Like I feel like
Yeah.
that's very much like
Yeah.
a hot topic right now. But I
Yeah.
think that one of the things that really stuck out for me is that like the actual data around the stark increase in mental health issues for young people
Yeah.
as like iPhones became more and more available to
Mm-hmm.
young people. I mean, I feel like adolescence is such a challenging time
Mm-hmm.
across history, and then when you
Yeah.
see like the rates at which kids are deteriorating, and I think there's a lot of pushback to say like, well, maybe it's this other thing, maybe it's the economy, like our 16-year-olds are worried about the economy suddenly, maybe it's the like all of these wars being broadcast, but like
Mm-hmm.
they've been able to really show like there's a very clear correlation between like when iPhones were introduced and this huge dramatic increase in not just reported mental health issues, because I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people think like, oh well, the more that you know that something exists, the more you're going to see it, like, but there's an increase in hospitalizations, there's been an
Yeah.
increase in like self-harm.
Yeah.
It's not just kids saying like I feel depressed, like there's all of these different lenses and
Mm-hmm.
measurements and metrics that have just jumped so
Mm-hmm.
much since then that like we're doing our kids a disservice if we're not paying attention.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I started this podcast. Like last year, I saw those rates in suicide, specifically in suicide attempts. And I mean, scrolling to death, like I literally saw the connection between the amount of
Mm-hmm.
scrolling being done by kids and their not wanting to be here anymore. And
Yeah.
that is not okay.
Heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking. And if every parent knew that connection, I felt like there's no way we're going to be allowing our kids to access social media. And I think a lot of parents are setting those rules more strictly now. But the problem is that they can get access to it on their friends' devices, on another device that they
On
get
the school
access to
device.
with, on the school device. So many places that we don't have control over. So that's why I'm putting a lot of effort into legislation and trying to get like COSA passed and Sammy's Law and these other bills that will force the companies to keep them safe or not show them this harmful, addictive, deadly content in some cases. So I think it's definitely good. Parent awareness is good, but also the tech companies have to do better. So
Yeah.
anything else that you want to share with parents today that we didn't cover related to screens or independent play? Anything that we didn't touch on?
Yeah, so I think that the main thing that parents come to me with in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like, how do we actually do like a low screen childhood
Mm-hmm.
uh, without making it like a ton of work is truly like through support, learning how to support independent play. And I think a lot of parents feel like there are only certain types of kids that can play independently.
Mm-hmm.
Independent play looks a certain way, like it's very quiet with toys. Like I think a lot of people have this like Montessori view of like what
Mm-hmm.
independent play looks like. Um, and I just want for parents to know that like your only child can play independently. Your child that has like 5 siblings that are always up in their business can play
Yep.
independently.
Mm-hmm.
Your high energy child can play independently. Your brand new infant can play independently, and you just have to really understand what independent play means and what it
Mm-hmm.
looks like and how to support it. And it takes so much off of the parent because
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge with screens is that we have become like this driver of constant entertainment for kids, and that's also not good for their development. So even
Mm-hmm.
if they're not watching TV, if you are constantly like directing and guiding their play,
Mm-hmm.
they're not getting the same benefits to play, and
Yeah.
they're not getting the same developmental results from play that a child who has an opportunity to be bored and to figure things out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much data that shows like emotional regulation is learned through independent play.
Mm.
And so I think we're seeing a rise in a lot of kids that have a lot of behavioral challenges. And I think that there is a very strong tie to the decrease in autonomous independent play for kids and those challenging behaviors.
Yeah. And knowing that you don't have to schedule your kid out the whole day, right? And giving them
Yeah,
time.
like
Yeah.
people ask me all the time, like, what is y'all schedule? I'm like, well, she wakes up and
Mm.
she has like we make breakfast together,
Yeah.
and she eats, and then like she plays, and then she eats lunch, and then she
Yeah.
plays, and then she takes a nap, and then she
Yeah.
plays.
Yeah. And if I'm bored, maybe we'll go to Target,
Yeah,
like,
like it's not like okay, from 2 to 4 is our active playtime, or like
yeah.
from 10 to 11 is sensory play.
Yeah.
Like no, like she just kind of bops around, and
Yeah.
she hangs out near me, but she figures out how to entertain herself, and
Yeah.
it's really amazing to see a kid who has done that since birth. And she has very high energy. She
Mm-hmm.
is she's very spicy. She's like the opposite type of child that people think when they think like independent play. Like she's not like the calm,
Yeah.
like playing nice, like
Yeah.
with little figurines. She's wild. She's feral. She's all over the place. She climbs things. Like
Mm-hmm.
she's, it's so much fun. And it's so nice to like see her get to have this like experience of early childhood.
Yeah. It's incredible that you saw that connection between the screen use and not being able to play independently in your son, and that you did have a nice little break there to be able to
Yeah.
learn those lessons, right, and apply them from birth. That's so wonderful. So I hope that parents will like take something from this and apply it to their own families, whether your kids are little toddlers, babies, or even older. Like I said, we can take a step back, pull it back a little bit, give it a couple of weeks to adjust, and then like see how everyone's feeling. And I bet that you'll see some improvements in the household, mood, and all of that. Andrea, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm a big fan of your work and the message you're pushing out to parents that like this independent play thing with Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, which I highly recommend. But one of his 4 new norms is like getting back to the play-based childhood with independent
Mm-hmm.
play. And so I thank you for supporting that message. I think it's so important. And again, just thank you for having this conversation with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.